The morning had started like any other at Forward Operating Base Atlas. Soldiers moved through their routines with practiced efficiency, checking equipment and preparing for another day in the harsh desert terrain. The sun was barely climbing over the distant mountains when the first explosion tore through the silence. Sarah Mitchell had been organizing medical supplies in the aid station when the blast knocked her off her feet. The walls shook violently, and bottles crashed to the floor around her. Her ears rang from the impact, but her training kicked in immediately. She grabbed her emergency kit and rushed toward the door, her heart pounding against her ribs. Outside, chaos had erupted across the base. Thick black smoke billowed from the fuel depot on the eastern perimeter, and flames were already reaching toward the sky like angry fingers. The heat hit her face even from 100 yards away. Soldiers were running in every direction, some shouting orders, others dragging injured comrades away from the burning structures. Sarah's eyes scanned the scene with professional detachment, cataloging injuries and priorities even as her mind raced. 3 soldiers were lying near the barracks closest to the explosion. 2 more were stumbling away from the flames, their uniforms smoking. She could see at least a dozen others scattered across the compound, some moving, some terrifyingly still. The communications tower had taken damage in the blast. Sparks were flying from severed cables, and the antenna hung at a dangerous angle. That meant they were cut off from headquarters. No immediate backup, no quick evacuation. They were on their own until someone fixed the radio or the situation stabilized enough to send a runner to the neighboring base 15 miles away. Sarah ran toward the nearest casualty, a young private who couldn't have been more than 20 years old. He was clutching his leg, blood seeping between his fingers. His face was pale with shock, eyes wide and unfocused. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands already moving to assess the wound. The shrapnel had torn through his thigh, missing the femoral artery by inches. Lucky. She worked quickly, applying pressure and wrapping the wound with practiced movements. Her voice was calm and steady as she spoke to him, telling him he would be fine, that she had him, that he just needed to stay with her. Another explosion rocked the base, smaller this time but closer. The ammunition storage. Sarah's blood ran cold. If the fire reached the main arsenal, they would all be in serious danger. The entire base could go up in flames within minutes. She finished securing the bandage on the private's leg and looked around desperately for help. 2 soldiers appeared at her side, and she directed them to carry the injured man to the aid station. Then she was moving again, racing toward the next casualty. The heat from the fire was intensifying. The wind had picked up, pushing the flames toward the center of the base. Burning debris was falling from the sky, landing on roofs and vehicles. Some of the tents were already catching fire. Soldiers were forming bucket brigades, but the water supply was limited, and the fire was spreading faster than they could contain it. Sarah reached a sergeant who was trapped under a collapsed wall section. His leg was pinned, and he was conscious but in obvious pain. She called for assistance and began working to stabilize his injuries, while others tried to lift the debris. The wood was hot to the touch, still smoldering from the explosion. Minutes felt like hours. Sarah moved from one injured soldier to another, triaging wounds, stopping bleeding, administering pain medication from her rapidly depleting supplies. Her uniform was soaked with sweat and blood. Her hands trembled slightly from adrenaline, but she forced them steady with each new patient. The fire continued to spread. More buildings were burning now. The mess hall, 2 of the barracks, and several supply sheds were engulfed in flames. The smoke was so thick in places that soldiers were coughing and struggling to breathe. Sarah distributed wet cloths to cover faces, knowing it was a temporary solution at best. She had counted 17 injured so far, with varying degrees of severity. 3 were critical. 5 had serious burns. The rest had blast injuries, broken bones, or lacerations, and those were just the ones she had reached. There could be more trapped in collapsed buildings or lying unconscious where she couldn't see them. The aid station was filling up quickly. Soldiers who could walk were helping those who couldn't. Sarah had organized a triage area outside the building, marking patients with colored tags to indicate priority. Red for critical, yellow for serious but stable, green for minor injuries. It was a system she had drilled countless times in training, but the reality was far more overwhelming than any exercise. As she worked on a soldier with severe burns to his arms and chest, Sarah caught sight of movement near the command building. The structure was still intact, though smoke was pouring from nearby buildings. She wondered briefly where Lieutenant Colonel Morrison was, the base commander. He should have been coordinating the response by now, but there was no time to worry about command structure. Another soldier needed her attention. A corporal with a head wound, blood streaming down his face. She cleaned the injury, checking for signs of concussion, and bandaged it tightly. He tried to stand, insisting he could help fight the fire, but she pushed him back down firmly. He would be no use to anyone if he collapsed from blood loss. The wind shifted suddenly, blowing smoke directly across the aid station. Sarah's eyes watered and she coughed violently, but she didn't stop working. Her hands moved automatically now, performing tasks she had done thousands of times. Clean the wound. Apply pressure. Secure the bandage. Check for other injuries. Move to the next patient. Time became meaningless. The sun climbed higher in the sky, turning the base into an oven. The combination of desert heat and raging fire was brutal. Several soldiers were showing signs of heat exhaustion on top of their injuries. Sarah distributed water from their emergency supplies, knowing they would run out soon if help didn't arrive. Through it all, one thought kept circling in her mind. Every soldier on this base was depending on her. The commander might organize the firefighting efforts and coordinate their defense if this was an attack. But right now, in this moment, she was responsible for keeping these men and women alive. And she would do whatever it took to make sure every single one of them survived until help arrived. Sarah's radio crackled to life on her hip, startling her as she finished wrapping a burned victim's arm. The voice coming through was distorted by static and background noise, but she recognized Sergeant Davis from the engineering unit. "Medic Mitchell, we've got 2 men trapped in the motor pool. The roof collapsed. We can hear them calling out, but we can't reach them without equipment." Sarah's stomach dropped. The motor pool was on the far side of the base, beyond the worst of the fire. She looked around at the injured soldiers surrounding her aid station. Leaving them felt wrong, but 2 men were trapped and possibly hurt. She made a decision in seconds. "I'm coming," she responded, then turned to Corporal Jenkins, a soldier with a bandaged shoulder who was helping organize supplies. "You're in charge here. Keep pressure on any bleeding wounds. If someone stops breathing, start CPR immediately. I'll be back as soon as I can." Jenkins nodded, his face pale but determined. Sarah grabbed her field medical kit and started running toward the motor pool. The route took her past burning buildings and through clouds of acrid smoke. She kept a wet cloth pressed over her nose and mouth, her eyes streaming from the irritation. The motor pool building had taken a direct hit from flying debris. The corrugated metal roof had caved in on one side, and support beams lay scattered across the ground like broken matchsticks. Several soldiers were already there, carefully moving rubble piece by piece. They looked up when Sarah arrived, relief evident on their soot-covered faces. "They're in the back corner," Sergeant Davis told her, pointing toward a section where the collapse seemed less severe. "We've been talking to them. One sounds okay, but the other isn't responding much. We're afraid of causing more damage if we move the wrong piece." Sarah assessed the situation quickly. The roof had created a kind of tent structure when it fell, leaving a small space beneath. She could see a gap between 2 large beams just wide enough for someone to crawl through if they were careful. "I'm going in," she announced. "That's not safe," Davis protested. "The whole thing could shift." "Then work fast to stabilize it while I'm in there," Sarah replied, already dropping to her knees. She pushed her medical kit ahead of her and began crawling into the narrow opening. The space was dark and hot, the metal above her radiating heat from the nearby fires. She could smell oil and gasoline, a dangerous combination in these circumstances. "Hello? Can you hear me?" She called out as she moved forward carefully, testing each movement before committing her weight. Her uniform snagged on twisted metal and she felt a sharp edge slice across her arm, but she kept moving. "Here. We're here." A voice came from the darkness ahead, strained but conscious. Sarah crawled toward it, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through gaps in the debris. She saw 2 figures huddled against the back wall. The first soldier, Private Morrison, was sitting upright, his uniform torn and dirty but apparently mobile. The second, Specialist Carter, was lying down, pinned from the waist down by a metal beam. His breathing was shallow and rapid, his face covered in sweat. Sarah reached them and immediately began examining Carter. His pulse was weak and racing. The beam across his legs was heavy but not crushing them completely. The greater danger was internal bleeding and shock. She couldn't tell the extent of his injuries without moving the debris, but she could stabilize him until they could get him out. "Morrison, are you hurt anywhere?" she asked while opening her medical kit. "Just scrapes and bruises, I think." My ears are ringing like crazy from the explosion, but I can move everything. Good. I need you to help me. Sarah pulled out an IV kit and began preparing it. When they lift that beam off Carter, he might go into shock from the sudden pressure change. We need to be ready. She inserted the IV into Carter's arm, starting a saline drip to help maintain his blood pressure. She also prepared morphine for pain management, but held off administering it until she knew more about his injuries. Giving pain medication to someone with internal bleeding could mask symptoms they needed to monitor. Davis, she shouted toward the opening. We need lifting equipment in here now. And bring more light. The next 20 minutes were tense. Soldiers worked to shore up the collapsed roof while others maneuvered jacks and pry bars into position. Sarah stayed with Carter, monitoring his vital signs and talking to him steadily, keeping him conscious and calm. Morrison sat beside them, holding a flashlight that someone had passed through the opening. The building groaned ominously several times, and dust and small debris rained down on them. Each time, Sarah held her breath, wondering if the whole structure would come down on their heads. But the soldiers outside knew what they were doing, and gradually, the space around them became more stable. Finally, with a coordinated effort, they lifted the beam off Carter's legs. Sarah examined the damage immediately. Both legs were badly bruised and swollen, but she didn't see any obvious fractures or arterial bleeding. That was the best news she could have hoped for. Still, he needed proper medical care as soon as possible. They rigged a makeshift stretcher using a door and carefully maneuvered Carter out of the collapsed building. Sarah crawled out beside him, squinting as she emerged into the bright sunlight. The base was still burning, though it looked like some of the fires had been contained. More soldiers had organized into effective firefighting teams. Sarah accompanied Carter back to the aid station, checking his vitals every few minutes. When they arrived, she found that Corporal Jenkins had managed the triage area remarkably well in her absence. He had even organized a shelter using tent material to protect patients from the sun and falling ash. 2 more came in while you were gone, Jenkins reported. Burns and smoke inhalation. They're stable but need monitoring. Sarah nodded and immediately got back to work. She settled Carter onto a cot and began a more thorough examination of his injuries. His legs would need x-rays to rule out fractures, and he would be severely bruised for weeks, but he would recover. She updated his triage tag to yellow and moved on to check on her other patients. The soldier with the head wound was sleeping, which concerned her until she verified he was responding to stimuli. Concussion protocol would require monitoring him for the next several hours. The private with the leg injury was awake, and even managing a weak smile when she checked his bandage. The sergeant with the crushed leg had been stabilized, but he would need surgery once they could evacuate him. As Sarah moved through the aid station, treating burns, wrapping wounds, and administering medications, she kept one eye on the fire situation. The flames had been pushed back from the central part of the base, though several buildings on the perimeter were still burning. The ammunition dump was still secure, thank God. If that went up, all her efforts would be meaningless. Her supplies were running dangerously low. She had used most of her bandages and was down to her last few IV bags. Pain medication was nearly depleted. If more casualties came in, she would have to start making difficult decisions about who received what treatment. But for now, everyone was alive. Battered, burned, and broken in some cases, but alive. Sarah allowed herself one moment to lean against the aid station wall, closing her eyes and taking a deep breath of the smoky air. Then she pushed off and returned to her patients. There was still so much work to do. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the devastated base. Sarah had lost track of time completely, measuring the day only in patients treated and supplies consumed. She was working on a soldier with second-degree burns across his back when she heard shouting from the direction of the communications building. A group of soldiers was gathered around the damaged structure, and someone was waving frantically. Sarah's heart leaped with hope. Had they managed to get the radio working? Could they finally call for help? She finished applying burn gel to her patient and jogged toward the commotion, her legs protesting after hours of constant movement. Sergeant Williams met her halfway. His face split in the first smile she had seen since the crisis began. "We've got partial communications restored," he said. "Signal is weak and keeps cutting out, but we managed to get a message through to headquarters. They're sending helicopters for medical evacuation and additional firefighting equipment. ETA is 45 minutes, maybe an hour." Sarah felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly buckled her knees. Help was coming. Her patients would get proper hospital care. They might actually get through this without losing anyone. That's amazing news, she managed to say. We need to prepare for the evacuation. The critical patients need to be ready to go immediately when the helicopters arrive. She hurried back to the aid station and began organizing her patients by evacuation priority. The 3 critical cases would go first, along with any others whose conditions had deteriorated. Then the serious injuries, and finally the walking wounded who could wait for ground transport. As she worked, Corporal Jenkins appeared beside her, carrying a crate of medical supplies. Found these in one of the storage sheds that didn't burn, he explained. Thought you might need them. Sarah could have hugged him. The crate contained bandages, IV fluids, and pain medication. Not a huge amount, but enough to make a significant difference. You're a lifesaver, Jenkins. Help me inventory what we have and what we'll need for the evacuation. They worked together efficiently, creating lists and organizing supplies. Sarah also began documenting each patient's injuries and treatment in case they were separated during evacuation. Her handwriting was shaky from exhaustion, but she forced herself to be thorough. The receiving hospital would need this information. A commotion near the western perimeter caught her attention. Soldiers were running toward one of the partially collapsed barracks, and she heard someone screaming. Sarah's stomach dropped. Another casualty, and at the worst possible time. She grabbed her kit and ran toward the building. When she arrived, she found soldiers carefully extracting a young woman from under a fallen wall. Private Chen had been trapped there since the initial explosion, pinned in a space so small and dark that no one had heard her calls for help until just now. Chen was conscious but in severe pain. Her left arm was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. Her face was covered in cuts and abrasions, and she was coughing from smoke inhalation. Sarah immediately began assessing her injuries while soldiers cleared away the last of the debris. The broken arm was the most obvious injury, but Sarah was more concerned about possible internal damage from being trapped for hours. She checked for signs of crush syndrome, a dangerous condition that could occur when compressed tissue was suddenly released. Chen's vital signs were relatively stable, but Sarah started an IV immediately and administered pain medication. You're going to be okay, Sarah told her gently, meeting the frightened eyes. Help is on the way. Helicopters will be here soon and we'll get you to a proper hospital. Chen nodded weakly, tears streaming down her dirt-covered face. I thought everyone forgot about me, she whispered. I thought I was going to die in there. Nobody forgot about you, Sarah assured her, carefully splinting the broken arm. We've been searching the whole base. I'm just sorry it took us this long to find you. As Sarah worked, she heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors. Her heart raced with anticipation and relief. She looked up to see 2 black dots growing larger on the horizon, accompanied by the unmistakable whump 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 of military helicopters. The base erupted in activity. Soldiers cleared a landing zone, marking it with smoke grenades. Sarah directed her team to prepare the critical patients for immediate transport. The 3 most serious cases were placed on stretchers and carried toward the landing zone. IV bags held high by walking soldiers. The first helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and debris. The rotor wash was intense, blowing everything that wasn't secured across the compound. The crew chief jumped out, followed by a team of paramedics carrying additional medical supplies. Sarah rushed forward to brief them on the patient's conditions. She spoke rapidly but clearly, providing vital information about each injury, treatment administered, and current status. The paramedics were professionals, asking quick questions and absorbing the information efficiently. The critical patients were loaded onto the first helicopter within minutes. Sarah watched as they lifted off, banking away toward the distant hospital. She felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Those 3 soldiers would get the advanced care they needed. They would survive. The second helicopter landed as the first departed. More paramedics emerged, along with 2 doctors who immediately began assessing patients. Sarah was grateful for their expertise but also protective of her charges. She had kept these soldiers alive for hours under impossible conditions, and she wanted to make sure they continued to receive proper care. One of the doctors, a captain named Richardson, approached her with a concerned expression. Medic Mitchell, we heard what you've been doing. That's remarkable work under extreme conditions. Are you injured at all? Sarah looked down at herself, suddenly aware of how she must appear. Her uniform was torn and stained with blood, both her own and others. She had a gash on her arm from crawling through the motor pool debris. Her hands were scraped and burned from handling hot metal. She was covered in ash and soot, and her face was probably streaked with tears and sweat. "I'm fine," she said automatically. "Just minor cuts. Everyone else is a priority." Richardson studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Let's get these soldiers evacuated. Then we'll take a look at you whether you like it or not." Over the next hour, helicopters came and went, ferrying patients to hospitals and bringing in additional medical personnel and firefighting equipment. Fresh troops arrived to help contain the remaining fires. The situation, while still serious, was finally under control. Sarah continued working alongside the newly arrived medical team, providing information about each patient and their treatment. She was running on pure adrenaline now, her body screaming for rest but her mind refusing to slow down. Private Chen was loaded onto the 4th helicopter. Sarah held her hand until the last moment. "You're going to be fine," she promised. "They'll take good care of you." Chen squeezed her hand weakly. "Thank you for saving my life." Sarah watched the helicopter disappear into the sky, then turned back to survey the base. The fires were almost completely out now, leaving behind smoking ruins and devastation. But the base was still standing, and most importantly, every soldier who had been alive when the crisis started was still alive now. She had done it. Against impossible odds, with limited supplies and no backup, she had kept them all alive until help arrived. The realization hit her suddenly and her legs finally gave out. She sat down heavily on a supply crate, her hands trembling. Captain Richardson appeared beside her again, this time carrying medical supplies. "All right, Mitchell, your turn. Let me see that arm." Sarah was too exhausted to argue. She let him clean and bandage the cut on her arm, along with various other minor injuries she hadn't even noticed acquiring. As he worked, other soldiers approached, thanking her, some with tears in their eyes. She had saved their friends, their brothers and sisters in arms. Through it all, one thought kept echoing in her mind. Where had Commander Morrison been during all of this? As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the damaged base, Sarah finally had a moment to process everything that had happened. The immediate crisis had passed. All the seriously injured soldiers had been evacuated. The fires were out, leaving only wisps of smoke rising from blackened structures. Fresh personnel had arrived to begin the cleanup and investigation. Sarah sat on the steps of the aid station, a bottle of water in her shaking hands. Her entire body ached with exhaustion. Captain Richardson had finished treating her injuries and had tried to convince her to evacuate with the wounded, but she had refused. This was her base, these were her people, and she wouldn't leave until she was absolutely certain everyone was accounted for and safe. Sergeant Williams approached her, his face serious. "Mitchell, the commander wants to see you in what's left of the headquarters building." Sarah's stomach tightened. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison. She had barely seen him during the entire crisis. While she had been racing from casualty to casualty, fighting to keep soldiers alive, where had he been? She stood up stiffly, her muscles protesting, and followed Williams across the compound. The headquarters building had survived relatively intact, though smoke damage marked the walls and several windows had blown out from the pressure of the explosions. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of burnt electronics and melted plastic. Morrison's office was at the far end of the hall. The commander stood when she entered, and Sarah was shocked by his appearance. Morrison was usually impeccably groomed, his uniform crisp and his bearing commanding. Now his face was haggard, his eyes red-rimmed, and his uniform was as dirty and disheveled as everyone else's. "Medic Mitchell," he said, his voice rough. "Sit down, please." Sarah sat in the chair across from his desk, waiting. She was too tired to feel nervous or defensive. Whatever was coming, she would deal with it. Morrison was silent for a long moment, staring at a point somewhere over her shoulder. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with emotion. "I owe you an explanation, and an apology." Sarah blinked, confused. An apology was the last thing she had expected. Morrison continued, his words coming slowly as if each one cost him something. "When the first explosion hit, I was in the command center with my communications officer, Lieutenant Hayes. The blast brought down part of the ceiling. Hayes was killed instantly. I was trapped under debris pinned from the chest down." Sarah's breath caught. Hayes had been a good man, always friendly, always professional. And Morrison trapped, unable to coordinate the response to the crisis he was responsible for. "I could hear everything happening outside," Morrison went on, his voice cracking slightly. "The secondary explosions. The fire spreading. People screaming, and I couldn't do anything. I couldn't even call for help because the radio equipment was destroyed and my personal radio was crushed under the same beam that had me pinned. He looked directly at Sarah now, and she saw anguish in his eyes. I heard someone say your name over the radio early on. I heard reports of casualties, and I kept waiting for someone to come for me, to organize a rescue, but everyone was too busy trying to stay alive and fight the fires. I was certain I was going to die in that room, listening to my base burn and my soldiers suffer. Sarah remained silent, processing this information. Morrison had been trapped and helpless while she had been running herself ragged trying to save everyone. The irony was painful. It wasn't until about 30 minutes ago that engineers clearing debris found me, Morrison said. They got me out, checked me for injuries. I have some cracked ribs and a lot of bruises, but nothing serious. And then I heard what you did. He stood up, moving carefully, clearly in pain from his injuries. He walked to the window and stared out at the destroyed base. Sergeant Williams gave me a full report. 23 casualties total. You triaged and treated all of them. You crawled into a collapsed building to reach trapped soldiers. You organized a triage center with no backup and limited supplies. You kept every single one of them alive until the medical evacuation helicopters arrived. Sarah didn't know what to say. She had just done her job, hadn't she? What else could she have done? Morrison turned back to face her, and to her shock there were tears in his eyes. I'm the base commander. I'm responsible for everyone and everything that happens here. And when the worst crisis of my career hit, I was useless, trapped, unable to lead. But you stepped up. You didn't wait for orders. You didn't hesitate. You just did what needed to be done. He moved back to his desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a small case. The official investigation into the cause of the explosion will take weeks. There will be reports to file, testimonies to give, and probably a review of my command decisions. But before any of that starts, I need you to know something. Morrison opened the case, revealing a medal inside. Sarah recognized it as the soldier's medal, awarded for heroism not involving actual conflict with an enemy. Her throat tightened. This is just a formality at this point, Morrison said. The official ceremony will come later, but I wanted you to know that I'm recommending you for this, along with a commendation for your actions today. What you did goes far beyond the call of duty. You saved lives through courage, skill, and selfless dedication. Those soldiers are going home to their families because of you. Sarah felt tears welling up in her own eyes. The exhaustion, the stress, the fear she had been suppressing all day finally broke through her professional composure. Sir, I just did what any medic would do. No, Morrison said firmly. What you did was extraordinary. Most medics would have set up a triage point and waited for casualties to come to them. You ran into danger repeatedly. You made life and death decisions under extreme pressure. You organized untrained personnel to assist you, and you did it all without command oversight, without backup, and with supplies that should have run out hours before they did. He came around the desk and extended his hand to her. Sarah stood and shook it, feeling the sincerity in his grip. Thank you, Medic Mitchell. Thank you for being the leader this base needed when I couldn't be. Sarah left the office in a daze, Morrison's words echoing in her head. She walked back through the base, seeing it with new eyes. Yes, there was destruction everywhere. Yes, they had lost buildings, equipment, and valuable supplies. Yes, Lieutenant Hayes had died, and that death would weigh on all of them. But 23 soldiers who might have died were alive. Some were already in surgery, getting the care they needed. Others were recovering in hospitals with injuries that would heal. Private Chen's broken arm would mend. Specialist Carter's crushed legs would require months of physical therapy. But he would walk again. The young private with the shrapnel wound would carry a scar but would return to duty. As darkness fell over forward operating base Atlas, emergency lights flickered on, powered by generators. Soldiers moved through the compound, some still fighting hotspots in the ruins, others beginning the massive task of salvage and cleanup. The base had been devastated, but it wasn't destroyed. It would be rebuilt, and they would continue their mission. Sarah returned to the aid station where Corporal Jenkins was organizing the remaining supplies. He looked up when she entered and gave her a tired smile. Doc said you should get some rest. I can handle things here if anything comes up. Sarah nodded gratefully. Her body was screaming for sleep, for food, for a shower to wash away the grime and blood. But first she had one more task. She sat down at the small desk and began writing in her medical log, documenting every patient, every injury, every treatment she had provided throughout the day. It took her nearly an hour to complete the entries, her handwriting getting progressively messier as exhaustion pulled at her, but she finished, closing the log with a sense of completion. The official record was there, a testament to what had happened and how they had responded. Finally, she allowed herself to leave the aid station. She walked slowly to her barracks, which had miraculously survived the fires with only minor damage. Inside, she found her bunk untouched, her few personal belongings exactly where she had left them that morning, which felt like a lifetime ago. Sarah collapsed onto her bunk fully clothed, too tired to even remove her boots. As she drifted toward sleep, images from the day flashed through her mind. The explosions, the flames, the injured soldiers, the fear in their eyes, the trust they had placed in her, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the sound of rebuilding beginning. Sarah woke to the sound of voices outside her barracks. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure of where she was or what had happened. Then the memories crashed back and she sat up quickly, her body protesting with every ache and pain accumulated from the previous day. Early morning light filtered through the windows. She had slept for nearly 12 hours, her exhausted body finally taking what it desperately needed. Sarah stood carefully, testing her muscles. Everything hurt, but nothing seemed seriously damaged. She was bruised, scratched, and incredibly sore, but she was functional. After a quick shower that turned the water brown with ash and grime, Sarah put on a clean uniform and headed outside. The base looked different in the morning light. The full extent of the destruction was more visible now. Entire buildings reduced to skeletal frames, vehicles burned out and unusable, equipment scattered and destroyed. But everywhere she looked, soldiers were working, teams were clearing debris, engineers were assessing structural damage, supply personnel were taking inventory of what had survived. The base was like a kicked anthill, with everyone moving purposefully to rebuild what had been lost. Sarah made her way to the temporary aid station that had been set up in one of the surviving buildings. Captain Richardson was there, along with 2 other medical officers who had arrived with the relief forces. They looked up when she entered. "Medic Mitchell," Richardson greeted her with a warm smile. "You look better. How are you feeling?" "Sore but functional," Sarah replied honestly. "What's the current situation?" Richardson gestured for her to sit, then pulled out a tablet with updated information. "All 23 casualties from yesterday are stable. The 3 critical patients underwent surgery last night and are expected to make full recoveries. Specialist Carter will need extensive physical therapy, but the orthopedic surgeon is optimistic about his leg function. Private Chen's arm was successfully set and she should regain full mobility." Sarah felt a profound sense of relief wash over her. They had all made it. Every single one of them. "That's wonderful news." "More than wonderful," Richardson said seriously. "It's miraculous considering the circumstances. I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen a single medic handle that kind of mass casualty situation with such effectiveness. You should be very proud of what you accomplished." The praise made Sarah uncomfortable. She had just done what needed to be done. "I had help. Corporal Jenkins and several others assisted with triage and patient care." "Yes, and they've all reported that you were the one who organized them, trained them on the spot, and directed the entire operation," Richardson countered. "Don't diminish what you did, Mitchell. Own it." Before Sarah could respond, Sergeant Williams appeared at the aid station entrance. "Mitchell, the investigation team wants to interview you. They're set up in the temporary command center. Commander Morrison asked me to escort you over." Sarah nodded and followed Williams across the base. The temporary command center had been established in one of the few buildings that had escaped serious damage. Inside, several officers in clean uniforms sat behind tables covered with documents, laptops, and recording equipment. The lead investigator was a stern-looking colonel named Patterson. He gestured for Sarah to sit and activated a recording device. "Medic Specialist Sarah Mitchell, thank you for meeting with us. We need to document everything that happened yesterday for our official report. Please walk us through your actions from the moment of the first explosion." Sarah took a deep breath and began recounting the events. She described hearing the initial blast, rushing outside to find chaos and immediately beginning triage. She explained her decisions about which patients to treat first, how she organized the aid station, and the challenges she faced with limited supplies. Patterson and his team listened intently, occasionally interrupting to ask clarifying questions. How many casualties did she estimate in the first 15 minutes? What was her assessment of the fire spread rate? When did she realize the communications were down? Each question was precise and professional. When Sarah described crawling into the collapsed motor pool to reach the trapped soldiers, one of the junior investigators, a captain, leaned forward with visible concern. You entered an unstable structure while fires were still burning nearby and fuel supplies were potentially compromised? Were you ordered to do that? No, sir, Sarah replied. There were 2 soldiers trapped, one of them injured. I had the training and equipment to help them. The decision was mine. Patterson made notes on his tablet. And during all of this, you had no contact with Commander Morrison or any senior officers? Correct, sir. I learned later that the commander was trapped in the command center. At the time, I assumed he was coordinating the firefighting efforts and trusted that I should focus on medical response. The questioning continued for nearly 2 hours. They wanted details about every patient, every decision, every moment of that chaotic day. Sarah answered as accurately as she could, though some details had blurred together in the intensity of the crisis. Finally, Patterson sat back and turned off the recording device. His stern expression softened slightly. That's all we need for now, Specialist Mitchell. Your testimony has been very helpful. I want you to know that preliminary findings suggest the explosion was caused by a fuel line rupture, likely due to equipment failure. This was not an attack, and there's no indication of negligence by base personnel. Sarah felt another wave of relief. At least they wouldn't be dealing with enemy action on top of everything else. Patterson stood and extended his hand. Off the record, what you did yesterday was exceptional. You exhibited leadership, courage, and medical expertise under the worst possible circumstances. The Army is lucky to have soldiers like you. Sarah shook his hand, accepting the compliment with a simple, "Thank you, sir." As she left the command center, she found a small crowd had gathered outside. Soldiers from various units. Some she recognized from yesterday's casualties, others who had arrived with the relief forces. When they saw her, they began applauding. Sarah stopped, frozen in surprise. The applause grew louder, and several soldiers called out their thanks. A young private stepped forward, tears in his eyes. You saved my brother yesterday. The one with the leg wound. I just wanted to say thank you. Sarah didn't know what to say. She had never expected recognition like this. She had just done her job, the job she had trained for, the job she had taken an oath to do. But looking at the faces around her, seeing the genuine gratitude and respect, she realized that what seemed like simply doing her duty to her had been extraordinary to everyone else. Over the next few days, life on the base settled into a new routine. The investigation continued, but it was clear that the explosion had been an accident, a tragic failure of aging equipment under harsh desert conditions. Recommendations would be made for improved safety protocols and equipment inspections across all forward operating bases. Sarah returned to her regular duties, treating minor illnesses and injuries, conducting health inspections, and maintaining medical supplies. But something had changed. Soldiers who had barely acknowledged her before now greeted her with respect and genuine warmth. Officers sought her opinion on medical protocols. Even the gruff sergeant major stopped by the aid station to personally thank her for saving his men. Commander Morrison had recovered from his injuries and was back to running the base, though he moved more carefully and seemed to carry the weight of Hayes' death heavily. He and Sarah had developed an unspoken understanding. They had both faced their worst nightmare that day, him trapped and helpless, her overwhelmed and undersupplied. They had both survived and learned something about themselves in the process. One evening, as Sarah was completing paperwork in the aid station, Corporal Jenkins appeared with a package. "This came for you on the supply transport," he said, handing her a large envelope with official military markings. Sarah opened it to find several documents, official commendations from the base commander and from regional headquarters, a letter informing her that she had been promoted to sergeant, and a formal notification that she would be receiving the Soldier's Medal in a ceremony scheduled for the following month. She stared at the documents, feeling overwhelmed. The promotion alone was significant, moving her up in rank ahead of the normal timeline. The medal was even more prestigious. But more than the official recognition, it was what the documents represented that moved her. They represented trust. They represented the acknowledgement that when everything went wrong, when command structure collapsed and communications failed, when fire and chaos threatened to destroy everything, one person had stepped up and made a difference. not because she was ordered to, but because it was the right thing to do. Jenkins was watching her with a knowing smile. "Congratulations, Sergeant Mitchell. Well deserved." Sarah looked up at him, then at the aid station around her, then out the window at the slowly rebuilding base. "Thank you, Jenkins. For everything you did that day. I couldn't have managed without help." "You gave us direction when we needed it most," Jenkins replied. "That's what real leadership looks like." After he left, Sarah sat alone in the quiet aid station, the documents spread before her. She thought about the soldiers she had treated, each face clear in her memory. She thought about the choices she had made, the risks she had taken, the fear she had pushed through, and she thought about the future. This experience had changed her, had shown her what she was capable of when pushed to her absolute limits. She had proven to herself that she could handle the worst crisis imaginable and come through it with everyone alive, whatever challenges lay ahead in her military career, whatever future crises she might face. She knew now that she had the strength, skill, and courage to meet them. The burning base crisis had tested her in ways she never imagined, and she had not just survived but had saved lives in the process. As darkness fell over Forward Operating Base Atlas, Sarah carefully filed the documents away and prepared to close the aid station for the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new patience, new responsibilities. But tonight she allowed herself to feel proud of what she had accomplished and grateful for the opportunity to serve alongside such dedicated soldiers. The base was still scarred by the fires, but it was healing, and so was she. 3 weeks had passed since the explosion that devastated Forward Operating Base Atlas. The rebuilding efforts were progressing steadily, with new structures rising from the ashes of the old ones. Supply convoys arrived regularly, bringing materials, equipment, and replacement personnel. The base was slowly returning to full operational capacity. Sarah walked through the compound in her new sergeant's uniform, still getting used to the increased responsibility that came with the rank. She now supervised 2 junior medics who had been assigned to the base, training them not just in standard medical procedures, but in crisis management and emergency response. The lessons she had learned during the fire were too valuable not to pass on. The ceremony for her medal presentation was scheduled for that afternoon. Dignitaries were flying in from headquarters, including a brigadier general who would personally present the award. Commander Morrison had been preparing for days, ensuring everything was perfect for the occasion. The base, despite its scars, would put on its best face for the visiting brass. Sarah spent the morning conducting routine medical checks on the work crews. The physical labor of rebuilding was taking its toll on some soldiers, with minor injuries and fatigue becoming common. She treated a sprained wrist, dispensed pain medication for sore backs, and reminded several overenthusiastic workers about the importance of staying hydrated in the desert heat. As noon approached, Corporal Jenkins, now promoted to Sergeant Jenkins in recognition of his own actions during the crisis, found her near the new motor pool construction site. "Time to get ready, Sergeant Mitchell. The general's helicopter is scheduled to land in 2 hours." Sarah nodded and headed back to her quarters to change into her dress uniform. It felt strange to be wearing the formal blues after weeks of dusty combat fatigues. She checked her appearance in the small mirror, adjusting her cap and ensuring every detail was perfect. The butterflies in her stomach reminded her that despite facing down a base-wide inferno, the prospect of standing in front of senior officers and having a medal pinned to her chest was still nerve-wracking. The ceremony was held in the newly rebuilt parade ground. Despite the short notice and ongoing reconstruction, the base personnel had created an impressive setup. Flags flew crisply in the desert breeze. Chairs were arranged in neat rows for the attending soldiers. A small stage had been constructed with a podium and microphone. As Sarah took her position near the stage, she scanned the assembled crowd. Nearly every soldier stationed at the base was present, along with the investigation team that had stayed to complete their work. She spotted several faces she recognized from the day of the fire, soldiers she had treated who were now fully recovered and back on duty. Commander Morrison stepped to the podium first, his bearing military perfect despite the lingering pain Sarah knew he still felt from his injuries. "Distinguished guests, fellow soldiers, we are gathered here today to recognize extraordinary heroism displayed during the crisis that struck our base 3 weeks ago." His voice carried across the parade ground, strong and clear. On that day when explosions and fire threatened to overwhelm us, When our communications were severed and our command structure was compromised, one soldier demonstrated exceptional courage, medical skill, and leadership. Sergeant Sarah Mitchell, please step forward. Sarah walked to the stage, her heart pounding. She stood at attention facing Morrison as he continued. On the 23rd of last month, Forward Operating Base Atlas suffered catastrophic equipment failure, resulting in multiple explosions and fires. In the chaos that followed, Sergeant Mitchell, then Specialist Mitchell, immediately began providing emergency medical care to casualties without regard for her own safety. Morrison paused, looking directly at Sarah with an expression of deep respect. Over the course of 8 hours, with no command oversight and limited supplies, Sergeant Mitchell single-handedly triaged and treated 23 casualties. She organized untrained personnel to assist in medical operations. She entered a structurally compromised building to reach trapped soldiers. She made critical life and death decisions under extreme pressure and hostile conditions. The assembled soldiers were completely silent, hanging on every word. Morrison's voice grew stronger. Thanks to her actions, every soldier injured that day survived. Every single one. That is not just competence. That is not just training. That is extraordinary heroism in the finest tradition of military service. He turned to face the crowd. Please welcome Brigadier General Hartman, who will present the award. The general stepped forward, a tall man with silver hair and a chest full of ribbons from a long career of distinguished service. He shook Morrison's hand, then turned to Sarah. His eyes were kind despite his intimidating presence. Sergeant Mitchell, General Hartman began, his voice carrying the authority of years of command. I have spent 32 years in the Army. I have seen combat. I have commanded troops in some of the most challenging environments imaginable, and I can say without hesitation that what you accomplished on that day ranks among the most impressive acts of courage and skill I have ever had the privilege to recognize. He opened a presentation case, revealing the soldier's medal gleaming against its velvet backing. The soldier's medal is awarded for heroism not involving actual conflict with an enemy. It recognizes voluntary risk of life under conditions other than combat. You more than earned this award, Sergeant. Your actions saved lives and demonstrated the very best of what it means to be a soldier. General Hartman pinned the medal to Sarah's uniform, then stepped back and saluted her. Sarah returned the salute, her eyes stinging with emotion she fought to control. The assembled soldiers erupted in applause, some standing, the sound washing over her like a wave. The general shook her hand firmly. Thank you for your service, Sergeant Mitchell. The Army is proud to have you. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the mess hall. Soldiers lined up to congratulate Sarah, shake her hand, and share their own memories of that chaotic day. The young private whose brother she had treated approached shyly, presenting her with a hand-carved wooden plaque that read, Guardian Angel of Base Atlas. We all chipped in and had this made, he explained. Figured you should have something to remember us by, though we'll never forget what you did. Sarah accepted the plaque, deeply moved. I'll treasure this. Thank you. General Hartman spent time speaking with various personnel, asking questions about the rebuilding efforts and the morale of the troops. When he found Sarah again, he pulled her aside for a private conversation. Sergeant, I've been reviewing your file. Your performance record was already strong, but this incident has put you on a different trajectory. Have you considered advanced medical training? Officer candidate school? Sarah was surprised by the question. She had been focused on recovering from the crisis and helping rebuild the base, not thinking about her future career path. I hadn't really considered it, sir. This is where I'm needed right now. Understandable, Hartman nodded. But don't sell yourself short. You demonstrated leadership that many officers twice your age would struggle to match. When you're ready to think about your next steps, my office door is open. The Army needs people like you in positions where they can make an even bigger impact. He handed her his card. Think about it. No pressure. But the opportunity is there when you want it. After the general's helicopter departed and the crowd dispersed, Sarah found herself alone on the parade ground as the sun began to set. She looked down at the medal on her chest, then at the wooden plaque in her hands, then at the base around her. The new buildings were taking shape. The scars of the fire were still visible but healing. Life was returning to normal, or at least to a new version of normal shaped by what they had all experienced together. The soldiers walking past her now did so with a different kind of confidence, a shared understanding that they had faced disaster and survived. Commander Morrison approached from the direction of his office. His dress uniform had been replaced with combat fatigues, already showing dust from the ongoing construction work. "Hell of a day, Sergeant." "Yes, sir," Sarah agreed. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the base prepare for nightfall. Finally, Morrison spoke again. "I've been thinking a lot about leadership lately, about what it means to be responsible for people's lives. That day taught me some hard lessons about the limits of command and the importance of initiative at every level." He turned to look at her. "You didn't wait for orders. You didn't worry about overstepping your authority. You just saw what needed to be done and did it. That's the kind of leader this army needs more of." Sarah considered his words. "I was terrified the whole time, sir. I just couldn't let that stop me." "That's courage in its purest form," Morrison replied. "Not the absence of fear, but action despite it. You should be proud of yourself, Mitchell. I know I'm proud to have you on my base." As darkness fell over Forward Operating Base Atlas, Sarah returned to her quarters. She carefully placed the medal in her locker alongside the wooden plaque and the official commendations. They were symbols of what she had accomplished, reminders of the day that had tested and transformed her. But the real reward wasn't the recognition or the promotion or even the medal. It was the knowledge that 23 soldiers were alive because of her actions. 23 people who would go home to their families, who would continue their lives and careers, who would have futures because she had refused to give up when everything seemed impossible. That was what being a medic meant. That was what wearing the uniform meant. And as Sarah prepared for another day of service ahead, she knew that whatever challenges came next, she would face them with the same determination and courage she had shown during the burning base crisis. 6 months after the fire, Forward Operating Base Atlas had been completely transformed. The new structures were more modern and better equipped than the originals. Advanced fire suppression systems had been installed throughout. Fuel storage had been relocated and upgraded with multiple safety redundancies. The painful lessons learned that day had been incorporated into every aspect of the reconstruction. Sarah stood in the new medical facility, a far cry from the small aid station where she had worked before. The building now featured an actual emergency room with proper equipment, expanded storage for medical supplies, and even a small surgery suite for emergency procedures. 2 examination rooms, a pharmacy area, and comfortable waiting space completed the transformation. She supervised a team of 4 medics now, each learning not just from manuals and training exercises, but from the real experiences she shared with them. Sarah had become something of a legend, not just on this base but throughout the entire region. Other medical personnel sought her out for advice. She had been invited to speak at training facilities about mass casualty management and crisis leadership. The junior medics were preparing for a training exercise when Sergeant Jenkins entered the facility. He had been promoted again and now served as Morrison's operations sergeant, a position of significant responsibility. "Got a minute, Sergeant Mitchell?" he asked. Sarah nodded and followed him outside. Jenkins had a serious expression that immediately put her on alert. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong exactly," Jenkins replied. "But there's something you should know. The Army Times is running a feature article about the fire. They interviewed Commander Morrison, General Hartman, and several of the soldiers you treated. It comes out tomorrow, and Morrison wanted you to be prepared for the attention it might bring." Sarah's stomach tightened. She had hoped the story would remain relatively contained, known within military circles but not publicized widely. "How big of an article are we talking about?" "Front page," Jenkins said with a slight smile. "With photographs. They're calling you the medic who saved Base Atlas." Morrison tried to get them to tone it down, but the reporter was pretty insistent that people needed to hear about what you did. That evening, Sarah received an advance copy of the article via email. The headline read, "One Medic, 23 Lives, the Heroism That Saved Forward Operating Base Atlas." The piece was thorough, documenting the entire crisis from multiple perspectives. They had interviewed Private Chen about being trapped in the rubble. Specialist Carter talked about his recovery and return to duty. The young private whose leg she had treated described watching her move from casualty to casualty with unwavering focus. But it was Commander Morrison's quoted words that struck her most deeply. "Sergeant Mitchell did more than save lives that day. She embodied everything we hope to instill in our soldiers: courage, competence, selflessness, and an unwavering commitment to her fellow service members." She is the kind of leader that makes me proud to wear this uniform. The article included several photographs. One showed the devastated base the day after the fire, smoke still rising from ruins. Another captured Sarah during the medal ceremony, General Hartman pinning the award to her chest. The most striking image showed her in the new medical facility, surrounded by the medics she now trained, her expression serious but warm. When the article published the next day, Sarah's phone began buzzing with messages almost immediately. Old friends from training reached out to congratulate her. Her parents called, proud but emotional about learning the full extent of what their daughter had endured. News outlets requested interviews. A military podcast wanted her as a guest speaker. The attention was overwhelming and uncomfortable. Sarah had never sought recognition. She had just done her job, the job she had trained for and committed to. But as more messages poured in, she began to understand that the story resonated with people beyond just military personnel. One email in particular caught her attention. It was from a young woman who had just enlisted and was heading to medic training. "I read your story in the Army Times," she wrote. "I've been nervous about whether I made the right choice joining the military. But reading about what you did, about how you saved all those lives, reminded me why I wanted to be a medic in the first place. Thank you for showing me what's possible when we don't give up." Sarah read the message several times, feeling something shift inside her. Maybe the attention did serve a purpose. Maybe sharing her story could inspire others, could remind people why military service mattered, could show young medics what they might be capable of in their darkest hour. Over the following weeks, Sarah accepted select interview requests, always focusing on the team effort rather than her individual actions. She talked about Corporal Jenkins and the other soldiers who had assisted with triage. She praised Commander Morrison's leadership in the aftermath of the crisis. She emphasized the importance of training and preparation, explaining how years of drills and exercises had prepared her for that terrible day. One interview took her back to the medical training facility where she had learned her trade. She spoke to a class of aspiring medics, young soldiers just beginning their journey. They sat in rapt attention as she described the chaos of the fire, the challenges of treating multiple casualties with limited resources, and the decisions she had made under pressure. "The most important thing I can tell you," she said to the class, "is that when the moment comes, trust your training. Trust your instincts, and remember that every patient counting on you is someone's son or daughter, someone's friend, someone's battle buddy. That responsibility is sacred, and it will give you strength when you need it most." After the talk, several students approached with questions. One nervous young woman asked, "Were you ever scared you might lose someone? How did you deal with that fear?" Sarah answered honestly, "I was terrified. Every single moment I was afraid I would make a mistake that would cost someone their life. But I couldn't let that fear paralyze me, so I focused on one patient at a time, one decision at a time, one treatment at a time. I broke the impossible task into manageable pieces and worked through them methodically." The student nodded, clearly taking the words to heart. "Thank you. I hope I can be half as brave as you were if I ever face something like that." "You will be," Sarah assured her. "Because when the moment comes, you won't be thinking about being brave. You'll just be thinking about saving lives." Back at Base Atlas, life continued its forward momentum. The base was now considered a model for safety and preparedness, with other installations sending personnel to study their improved systems. Commander Morrison had received his own commendation for the base's recovery and reconstruction. Though he always deflected credit to his team, Sarah's medical facility had become a training ground for crisis response techniques. They ran regular drills, simulating various disaster scenarios and practicing mass casualty response. The lessons from the fire had been codified into training protocols that were being adopted across the military medical system. One afternoon, as Sarah was reviewing supply inventories, a young soldier appeared at the medical facility entrance. He was new to the base, his uniform still crisp and his demeanor respectful but uncertain. "Sergeant Mitchell? I'm Private Williams. I just got assigned here and I wanted to introduce myself. I'm going to be working with the engineering unit." Sarah shook his hand welcomingly. "Welcome to Base Atlas, Williams. What brings you by the medical facility?" The private hesitated, then spoke quietly. "My cousin was Specialist Carter, the one whose legs got crushed in the motor pool collapse. Had told me that if I ever got stationed here, I should find you and say thank you. He said you crawled into that building when nobody else would, that you probably saved his life." Sarah remembered Carter vividly, remembered his pale face and rapid breathing, remembered the tense minutes waiting for them to lift the beam off his legs. "How is he doing?" "He's great," Williams said with obvious pride. "He finished his physical therapy ahead of schedule, returned to full duty last month. He still has some pain when the weather changes, but otherwise you'd never know how badly he was hurt. He wanted me to tell you that he got engaged. He's getting married next summer." The news filled Sarah with warmth. Carter would have a life, a future, a wedding day with his fiancée. "That's wonderful. Please tell him I'm happy for him and wish him all the best." After Williams left, Sarah stood at the window of her facility, looking out at the rebuilt base. The physical scars of the fire were gone now, replaced by stronger structures and better systems, but the memory of that day would always remain, etched into the collective consciousness of everyone who had been there. She thought about all the lives that had intersected with hers during those crucial hours. 23 soldiers who would carry on with their lives, their careers, their families. Some would leave the military and return to civilian life. Others would continue serving, perhaps becoming leaders themselves one day. Carter would get married. Chen was already talking about re-enlisting. The young private with the leg wound had been accepted to officer training school. The ripples from that one terrible day extended far beyond what she could see. Every life saved would touch countless other lives. Every soldier who returned home would impact their community. Every future they would have was a future that might not have existed without her actions. Sarah understood now that this was her legacy, more meaningful than any medal or newspaper article. She had given 23 people their futures back when those futures hung by the thinnest of threads. And in doing so, she had fulfilled the deepest promise of military service: to protect and preserve the lives of those who serve alongside you. As the sun set over Forward Operating Base Atlas, painting the desert sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Sarah prepared to close the medical facility for the day. Her junior medics had already left and the base was settling into its evening routine. She took one last look around the facility, at the equipment that was ready for any emergency, at the supplies carefully organized and stocked, at the systems designed to save lives. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new patients, new responsibilities. But tonight she allowed herself to feel satisfied with what she had accomplished, not just during the fire but in the months since. She had proven that one person, properly trained and sufficiently determined, could make a difference when it mattered most. And if another crisis ever came, if another disaster threatened the base and its personnel, she would be ready. They would all be ready. Because the burning base crisis had taught them that survival wasn't about luck or hoping for the best. It was about preparation, courage, and the unwavering commitment to never leave a fallen comrade behind. Sarah Mitchell locked the medical facility door and walked across the base toward her quarters. The weight of her medal, and the memories of that day, a constant reminder of who she was and what she stood for: a medic, a leader, a guardian who had protected every soldier before the commander even arrived, and who would continue protecting them every day that followed.